We're trying, we're an outsourced SDR agency, and part of the questions we get asked all the time is like, what's the best stack? And everyone's obviously got their bias. So what we're looking to do is talk to people who actually use these technologies and like implement them and just kind of get their read on it, kind of like almost like an unfiltered opinion. Obviously it's heavily skewed to like marketing tech and sales tech, because we want to talk to like leaders of marketing teams and sales teams who can say, yeah, this technology is awesome. This is how we use it. This is how I recommend you use it or don't use it. So we're just hoping to kind of have a chat like a bit about, in your case specifically, I think we said Gong, right?
I can't talk about implementation or pricing.
That's fine.
So I can really talk about it as a user when I was at Riskified. I was there for 3 years, so I kind of got a bit of a sense of it, but I haven't implemented it where I am now. I've only been there for a month, and I probably won't implement it. I'll look for cheaper alternatives, but I'm sort of just giving you the kind of the background. But so we can go from there. But there's definitely some areas I feel like in terms of pricing and all of that. I know anecdotally, but I don't have I've never received a proposal for them.
I think it's more interesting just to get like a take of like, and maybe just tell us a bit about like how did you use it? So like, what's your experience been like? Why did you guys bring it in? Into Riskified, for example, like why did you bring in Gong?
Yeah, it was there before I arrived. So I arrived, and from day one, I think what was interesting for me was I'd come from a sales environment where nothing was recorded, and there was no culture of coaching. There was no thoughts about feedback. It was just go and get deals, basically. So to all of a sudden walk in to find out that interviews were being recorded. Many calls were recorded. Even sometimes internal calls were accidentally recorded. But certainly all of my sales calls were automatically recorded. Gong automatically was set up as the note taker. And it took some adjustment. I think in the beginning, I felt a bit like it was Big Brother watching. It felt very much like in a lab almost, like a hamster on a hamster wheel, with someone watching every minute move that I would make on camera and provide me feedback. And why did you ask the question like that? And that was too closed. And your pause wasn't long enough. And I think in the beginning, I found it really difficult. It knocked me off my sort of a certain natural confidence. I felt was completely just shattered. But I think over time, I learned to appreciate it and value the feedback, and that it was actually helping me improve my craft. Particularly when things that I thought about myself around, sometimes I just talk too much and don't shut up. And then there was kind of validation that your longest monologue is 4 minutes, and recommended time is under 2 minutes or whatever it was. You sort of start to think, oh shit, that story could have been condensed, probably like a little bit like now, and it would have been a good thing for everyone.
So like, let's talk about when you started, right? So, or even before you started with Gong. So in the previous environment, you were kind of out there doing your thing. If you when did you usually get feedback? Was it only on if the deal closed or if it didn't close, or at all?
I've got to be careful here.
Okay. So let's say traditionally,
there wasn't a lot of coaching or feedback in the previous environment. And so to go to environment, and nothing was recorded. There was no concept of things being recorded. And to go to a place where it was being recorded, analyzed, actually watched by my sales manager, or director at the time, made it quite a different environment, and really meant that, early on I went through a boot camp, and there were simulations that were recorded, and, detailed comments left on, minute 16, you didn't let the person finish. You needed to, show a bit more empathy here, or that question was framed that, great question. You really, the discovery here sort of, went to another level because you really sort of thought about what they were saying. And, it was that level when Gong was there, that certainly made a difference to the way I thought about sales and the level of rigor, I think, that goes into every aspect of the deal.
But just on the feedback thing, you said that like initially your confidence was really shaken by it. Use the classic Aussie, it was shattered. Like I get, feedback's one of those things that you've also got to be willing and able to handle. Like was that, just like what was that like? I mean, is it, did you feel like from did it leave you initially feeling like you don't know what you're talking about? Or was it just like I had no idea that I was making all these errors? I thought I was great.
Um, there was definitely a moment of realizing certain things about myself that, I mentioned that the monologue that I often had these really long stories. And I always thought that they were entertaining and that I, people in the palm of my hand, but actually, people had switched off and totally disengaged. So that was like a very specific thing that you can work on and change. It did validate some things for me, which were sort of that my style was a little bit, I guess, slower, that I sort of would sit on a call and kind of think a little bit. And that sometimes that awkward silence brought me some more information provided by the person I was speaking to. And that if I looked relative to my peers and I started doing this a little bit, that I had a slightly longer pause than maybe some of my colleagues. And that was an interesting cultural thing as well. Some of my colleagues were native born Israeli. I was, born in Australia, slightly different style of interaction. On certain calls, my interactivity was lower. So there was less ping pong between me and the prospect. That has some positives and some negatives, but I kind of only picked that up through Gong. Going back to the specifics about at the beginning, was my confidence shattered? I think there were bits that really sort of forced me to self-reflect, not just professionally, but also personally. It's like, wow, this is also my personal life where, maybe I'm speaking a little bit too much. So it was very much a real mirror to me as a person, which was, can be both a good and bad thing.
Well, Gong's like one of those tech that kind of fly in the face of that debate of is sales art or science? Like how did you feel about that? I mean, do you think that also specifically to your comment about having colleagues with different backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, and their speed, do you feel like it can mold or clone best performance, and there is like a science to it?
So this was interesting. One thing that I found was that in terms of an onboarding tool, those that started with me and those that started after me, became almost a rule in my head that those that listened to more calls became better reps quicker. There was no doubt in my mind, particularly when I started managing, that I remember there were sort of two AEs account executives who started around the same time. And one just ate through Gong. They listened to, tens and tens of calls a day. And one didn't make use of the tooling quite the same way and just wasn't really, just going through and listening to random calls and really kind of immersing themselves in the new company. And you saw their trajectory just, in the beginning, they sort of started about equal. And then you just sort of saw this diversion where one sort of really took it on and became, a great salesperson, a real asset. And one, within about half a year was actually out the door. So it was one of those things where you could almost track that amongst people who joined the company about their level of progression internally, understanding of the product, particularly on an enterprise, more technical sale. Those that could really get into the detail had heard the question be asked before, had heard that objection, had heard that sort of piece of feedback and heard other people deal with it, that tended to do better. I think for me personally, there was a bit of a risk of saying, well, there's that top rep over there. That's how they do it. Well, that's how I should do it. And it probably took me a year, maybe even a year and a half to realize that I had my own style. I didn't have to behave like they did. I didn't have to be like them to be successful. And I think probably in that respect, Gong was a bit of a negative for me because I spent a lot of time trying to model my behavior on people internally. And I just wasn't them. I wasn't the Israeli sales guy. I was the Australian sales guy. I mean, lots of other personality differences as well. But it took me time to kind of get to that point of being comfortable enough to say, look, I've seen all of that on Gong. I've seen that person. I've seen them close huge deals. That's great. That's for them. It's not for me. So yeah, some positives and negatives there.
Do you think it's the technology like that made that person better than the other? Or do you think it's the fact that one person was a personality who was willing to review and adapt what they were doing and the other person wasn't? Or is it a mixture of both? Like, is in it could be both, and you could say, yeah, you need people that need to be able to reflect and review, but also need a tool to help them review these things. What's your take? You are a manager as well. Like, what's your
Yeah.
take on
Well, I think that was the interesting part of going from we can speak about going from rep to manager and how I use the tool differently. But maybe to sharpen your question, is it just the call recording that Gong provides that you really need? Is that actually the main asset? Or is it some of the analysis that Gong does, some of the prompters that they give you, some of the follow-up reminders that they send you, some of the, call it the AI, quote unquote, that actually helps you? Or is it just the fact that you've got all of your calls centralized in one location? And it's something that, I've been thinking about a lot in preparation for this. I don't have a clear answer yet about whether it's just the fact that everything's recorded in the one place and tracked, which you can obviously do a lot more cheaply. I think Zoom's got a function to record for free and have it all in a library. So there's that aspect. But yeah, look, it was a great tool for people to be able to actually onboard faster. There's no doubt about it. And you saw it very, very direct. I saw it multiple times, both people that I started with 3 other people in a boot camp, and you sort of saw the diversion even amongst us of those that really listened to a bunch of calls and those that didn't. In particular, in our cohort, basically none of us had any meaningful sales background. So it was really interesting to see people go through that journey. Yeah.
as a manager? You mentioned that when you started, before you were a manager, when you started, you had this feeling like your director's listening to all your stuff and writing notes, right? Minute 16 and whatever. So when you were a manager, did you feel like it helped you there? Like, did it give you the ability to zoom in on specific weaknesses or provide feedback to your team?
I think I made the classic mistakes of a first-time manager, which was that I just sort of left the comments. And sometimes I made the mistake of making them public, which I think is a real mistake. Like, I think coaching is best delivered one-on-one and kind of as a discussion. And particularly once it's in writing, I think it kind of hammers home the point in a way that you don't necessarily always want or even intend. And so I made the classic mistake of kind of following what had come before me in a way and kind of, furiously writing comments on almost every minute of a call. And I think that was to my detriment and probably to my team's detriment as well. Having said that, though, there were times where I think it was useful to set up a coaching session with the team and have the comments that I've left there almost separately and only put them in almost afterwards. And that way it was kind of an open discussion between us about, hey, look, minute 16, you moved on to discussing next steps. Maybe there are a few more questions here to kind of just think about that could have made this a richer conversation and could have kind of helped us progress this deal in a better way. I found that was more useful, and I'm not sure I necessarily needed Gong for that. The ability to annotate and take notes is anyone can do that on any call, but it was certainly a useful way to kind of have that set up and have that. I don't know if you've seen it, but to have it on the side of the screen and to have it ready and available, and then to be able to quickly just reference back to a certain moment of the call. I think that was key, and obviously to search for a keyword in the transcript. So if you remember that, someone saying, delegating to someone else in the team, you could go back and find that pretty easily, which is certainly a good way to coach. It's like, hey, that was a really key moment in the call. Let's go back and look at it.
So it sounds like, to make something like this work, I think firstly it sounds like there's an open question about, hey, listening to recorded sales calls in and of itself, irrespective of the tool, is that beneficial? Then it also sounds like there's a lot of work to be done about how to make feedback and coaching consumable. How to, like, if you're putting a new sales rep in an environment where they know that they're being listened to and monitored and measured, you need to think about that, right? And also how you give feedback. Don't just from your words, right? Don't just put it in writing,
Yeah.
Hey, minute 16, what are you doing, mate? But then also as a manager, it sounds like there's also an element there that you need to think about, like that coaching side of things, in order to like really get the most out of any, I guess, solution like this. One other question for you is, do you think like something like Gong, does it make more sense for bigger teams? We didn't ask how big your team was, but like, do you think it kind of kicks in value at a certain size team?
Yeah, good question. Look, I think even really small teams can get benefit from, having calls recorded. And it's certainly something that, even in my new role, I'm pushing for, is to have some element of call recording and call analysis software available. So I do think there is benefit even for a small company. I think just for a small company, particularly when you're trying to find product market fit and you're dealing with your first customers, that those questions and those pieces of feedback early on, I think, are critical, and making sure they're captured. I've already had an early debate with my CEO around, do we need a call recording tool? He doesn't come from a world where he thinks it's necessary. I do. So having that conversation has been really interesting. And at the same time, we had a call recently where I thought the client said X, the prospect said X, I thought the prospect said Y, and I'm sort of, I'm like praying. It's like, damn, imagine if we'd had that recorded, just how easily that would settle the debate. So I think there is value for small teams. I think where you do really kind of get the real value, though, is when you've got larger teams, and particularly as a new rep. I remember a particular rep who'd been at the company for many, many years, and I watched many of her calls in the beginning, and I learned a lot from watching the way she went about what she did, and so much so that I only met her in person many years later. And I said to her, look, I feel like I know you. I've heard you at home, particularly during COVID. I've heard you speaking to clients, from your car, from your office, from the office. I've seen you tired, hungry. I've seen you kind of in all aspects, but I've seen you sell as well. And it's amazing what you can learn. And then I think when it got towards the end of my stint in previous company, I had many new people reach out to me being like, hey, I watched that call. That was awesome. That really made sense to me. Or, that was an interesting way to explain it. Thanks so much. It's really helpful. So I guess it kind of lives on after these call recordings. And I think that's where teams can really get benefit from it. I would say there's probably not enough curation done of management and kind of sales enablement on these tools. It's often kind of left to reps to kind of go hunting in the wild for previous pricing calls or great negotiation calls that happened, or great discovery calls for that matter. But there's a lot of richness in tools like Gong that probably aren't fully utilized by the teams that are paying thousands and thousands of dollars a month for them.
That's awesome. So it sounds like that's one element that could probably be improved, which is like a way to kind of categorize it and say, hey, and maybe the tool can support that, but it's just not being done.
Absolutely can.
Yeah. Like, would you say that is the one kind, like, is that a missing piece there? It's like this ability for managers and sales leaders to kind of make the most out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I get the feeling that, if you were part of the Gong product team, you're probably like, most people using it are only getting 50, 60% out of it. And there's probably a bunch of things. And even me, who was there at 3 years using the tool, there's probably a lot of functionality I didn't even get to. But I think that's kind of where probably a strong sales enablement team. But again, you're talking about already companies that are of significant size that can kind of afford to have those sort of shared resources and sales coaches and all that kind of thing. I think it's less relevant in kind of the startup land that we typically operate in.
Cool. Last question for you. If you had to recommend any tool that you think a sales team couldn't live without, is there anything that you think is like, it's got to be there, especially in today's kind of modern selling environment?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that whether it's Gong or another call recording tool, and I've looked at some alternatives recently, whether it's a company called Meet Record in India with 7 people who've got a basic recording tool for, a handful of dollars a month, through to Wingman, who are acquired by Clarity, which would be a, Gong competitor. through to Sales Loft, who have their own conversational intelligence, call recording software, not as rich as Gong's and not as impressive on the analytics side, but there are alternatives out there that allow you to record calls, and depending on what you're looking for, there are different ways to do that. But to me, it's changed my thoughts about selling and probably more generally about life, which is that kind of when you've got the ability to play it back, it can be a bit ugly, it can be a bit awkward, but the reality is that you get better from it. And so I strongly encourage any sales leader out there looking for tech that it's a pretty good place to start, particularly if you're doing remote-based sales. It's a pretty damn good place to start.
Awesome, man. So it's funny, like, no matter how technically advanced we get, communication plays like such a huge part in selling still. It's not like we've got AI to teach us how to sell better, but we haven't yet got the AI buying and selling stuff, right? So like, I guess, that's a key piece here, is like learning how to become a better communicator. Obviously, sales is just a very focused discipline around building relationships and building trust and mutual acceptance, which again, as you said, plays off into so many other things in your life, because you start to kind of, I guess, analyze. If you're introspective, which clearly you are, you start to say, well, wait a second, is this just a behavior that I'm doing in my sales role, or is actually this a behavior that I'm doing the rest of my life? And hey, maybe if I take some of these lessons on in a broader context of like listening, creating space for that person to answer, questions that I've asked, reflecting on those, that can add some a lot of value. All right, well, that's amazing, and I think that's obviously very valuable real world feedback on using a solution, which is exactly like what we're trying to achieve here. Is just to give people an honest sense of, hey, I use a solution. I don't work for this company. This isn't an ad for them, but I'm just trying to help you make an assessment to say, is it Gong? Maybe, right? Is it a bunch of these other solutions that you mentioned? Possibly. But in the end, I think what you're already saying is having the ability to have your calls recorded and being able to review those conversations is like that's a real differentiator between performance.